All right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling a pretty hot topic.
Yeah.
The clash between pop star Selena Gomez and former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're like, is this just celebrity gossip or is there something deeper going on here?
But there is.
Oh, there totally is.
I mean, I think this whole thing kind of blew up because it brings up some really huge questions about immigration here in America.
Absolutely. I mean, at the surface, it might look like just a Twitter war or whatever, but what's fascinating is that it actually exposes these like really deep societal cracks, especially when it comes to how we view and treat immigrants.
Right. And Selena's been super vocal about this kind of stuff for a while now.
Yeah.
Right? Like she's spoken out a ton about mental health, LGBTQ plus rights, all that.
Yeah, she's definitely not afraid to use her platform to push for change. Remember when she testified before Congress about mental health resources for young people? I mean, that was a big deal.
Huge. So it's not really a surprise that she spoke out about Trump's immigration policies, too, which she did,
Yeah.
and called them inhumane.
And specifically called out his like attempts to end DACA and stuff.
Yeah, and his, like, mass deportation policies, too.
Right, right. And I mean, Trump being Trump, he couldn't just let that slide. He basically told her just stick to singing and to get a life.
Oh, classic Trump.
Totally. But see, that's the thing. Those kind of snarky comments aside, this whole exchange, it like throws a spotlight on two totally different ways of looking at immigration.
So let's break those viewpoints down. We know that Selena is advocating for a more humane approach, calling for compassion and understanding.
Yeah.
But to grasp the full picture, we got to delve into Trump's stance, right? I mean, his presidency was a whirlwind of some of the most controversial immigration policies we've seen.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We're talking zero tolerance at the border, family separations, the whole 9 yards. It was
a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, the zero tolerance policy alone that resulted in thousands of families being separated, sparking outrage all over the world.
It was definitely a dark time. And then there were his constant attempts to dismantle DACA, creating a wave of anxiety for literally hundreds of thousands of young people whose entire lives have been here in America.
Yeah, people who only know the U.S. as their home.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that DACA recipients, they're not just statistics, right? They're individuals who've grown up here, gone to our schools, contributed to our communities in countless ways.
They're Americans in every way except on paper.
Exactly. And the thought of them losing their protected status, I mean, it was a huge deal.
Yeah, it had major implications for their lives, their futures. So we've got the background on Selena and Trump's stances, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What were the exact words exchanged that set this whole social media firestorm ablaze?
Well, Selena made this post, right? It was on social media, and she basically called out Trump's mass deportation policies. She said they were heartless, and she urged her fans to stand up for immigrants.
And I bet Trump fired back pretty quickly.
Yeah, almost immediately. He's not exactly known for holding back, is he? He basically told her to, like, focus on her music and leave politics to the politicians.
Oof. And that probably just made things even more intense.
Oh, totally. Social media just went nuts. Fans, celebrities, politicians, everyone was chiming in. Some were praising Selena for speaking out, saying she was using her platform for good, for social justice and stuff.
And others were probably criticizing her, right? Like saying she should stay in her lane.
Oh, yeah, you had that whole side of things, too. People criticizing her for, speaking out against a former president and all that.
So basically the whole thing became this huge proxy war for the larger immigration debate.
Exactly. I mean, this clash, as public and kind of dramatic as it was, it really mirrors the deep divisions we have in America when it comes to immigration.
So let's talk about those divisions. Let's unpack them. Because it all started with Selena calling out Trump's stance on illegal immigration, which, let's face it, is a topic that always sparks intense debates. But before we get into all that, I think we need to define what we mean by illegal immigration in the context of the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the U.S., illegal immigration refers to people who either enter the country without permission or those who overstay their visas. It's honestly a really complex issue with a ton of historical baggage, and it's super important to approach it with nuance,
Yeah, it's definitely not black and white.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the emotional arguments without truly grasping all the intricacies involved.
Absolutely. And one thing that often gets lost in all the noise is the human cost, the personal stories, the struggles, the very real consequences that undocumented immigrants face every single day.
Right. We tend to forget that behind all the political rhetoric and the statistics, we're talking about real people with real lives.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the human side of things, I think it's important to explore the different arguments both for and against illegal immigration. And let's start with the economic side of it, because that's often a major point of contention.
Okay, so from an economic standpoint, opponents of illegal immigration, they argue that undocumented immigrants place a strain on public resources like healthcare and education. They also claim that they drive down wages for American workers, especially those in low-skill jobs.
So basically, the argument is that they're a drain on the system and a threat to American jobs. But I imagine there's a counter-argument to that, right?
Yeah.
Don't proponents of immigration argue that undocumented immigrants actually benefit the economy?
Right, they do. They point out that undocumented immigrants often fill these essential roles in industries like agriculture and construction jobs that, frankly, a lot of Americans aren't willing to take.
So they're filling a labor gap and keeping key industries running. And don't forget, they also pay taxes, right? Sales tax, property tax, even income tax in some cases.
Exactly. Their economic contributions are often overlooked in these debates. But they're entrepreneurs, they're consumers, and they're taxpayers, just like everyone else.
So the economic argument is clearly pretty nuanced, not a simple case of good versus bad. But beyond the economic factors, there are also social and cultural dimensions to consider, right?
Oh, absolutely. Some people argue that large-scale illegal immigration can lead to social tensions, especially in communities where resources are already stretched thin or where there are significant cultural differences.
Right. We've seen cases where an influx of immigrants has sparked debates about things like language, assimilation, even the preservation of national identity.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, many argue that immigrants, regardless of their legal status, bring vibrancy and diversity to American culture. And let's be real, they've enriched our culture in countless ways.
Think about food, music, art, fashion, all that immigrants have had a massive impact.
Totally. And let's not forget the entrepreneurial spirit that many immigrants bring. They often start businesses, revitalize neighborhoods, create jobs.
Absolutely. They contribute to the energy and innovation that America's always been known for.
Okay, so we've talked economics, we've talked culture, but there's another huge piece of this puzzle that we can't ignore: national security.
Yeah, this is where things get really heated. Opponents of illegal immigration often argue that a porous border allows criminals and even potential terrorists to slip into the country undetected.
And that's a valid concern, right? No country wants to compromise its security.
Yeah.
But we also have to remember that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants aren't criminals. They're just people looking for a better life for themselves and their families.
Exactly. They're often fleeing poverty, violence, persecution, willing to risk everything for a shot at a better future.
And that brings us back to the human element, to the personal stories and sacrifices that often get overshadowed by the political back and forth.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff. But it's crucial to remember that behind all the stats and the political debates, there are actual human beings with lives and hopes and dreams.
And those dreams are often born out of desperation, right? I mean, these are folks escaping violence, poverty, persecution, all that. They're risking it all for a chance at a better life. So what are some of the things they face when they get to the U.S.?
Imagine living every single day with the fear of being deported. I mean, just the constant anxiety that a simple traffic stop or even just going to the grocery store could lead to being ripped away from your family and sent back to a country you might barely even remember. That's the reality for a lot of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, that level of uncertainty and stress is hard to even fathom. And I bet that fear makes them super vulnerable to exploitation too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Undocumented immigrants are way more likely to be victims of wage theft, workplace abuse, all sorts of terrible things. But they're often too scared to report these crimes because they're afraid of getting deported. You know what I mean?
Right, so they're trapped in this system that silences them, even when their basic rights are being trampled on. It's just awful. And then there's the emotional toll of being separated from their loved ones. I mean, we all saw the devastating effects of family separations under that zero-tolerance policy.
Yeah.
But even outside of that specific policy, families are always at risk of being torn apart.
Absolutely. Parents being separated from their children, spouses living in constant fear of losing each other, kids growing up with this anxiety of having their families ripped apart. It's a lot. And the trauma of these experiences, it can have long-lasting psychological impacts, leading to things like anxiety, depression, even PTSD.
It's a harsh reminder that when we're talking about immigration, we're not just talking about these abstract ideas like border security or economic impact. We're talking about real human beings, people whose lives are deeply affected by these policies.
Right. Their stories need to be heard. Their experiences should be shaping our decisions about immigration policy. If we want to have a real conversation about this, we can't just stick to talking points. We have to acknowledge the human cost.
Okay, so we've talked about how complex this issue is, the arguments on both sides, the very real human toll it takes. So where do we go from here? How do we get past this seemingly endless back and forth and actually find some solutions?
Well, it's a tough question and there's no easy answer.
Mhm.
But I think acknowledging that there are valid concerns on both sides is a good place to start.
Like the concerns about border security and the economic impact of illegal immigration.
Exactly. We can't just dismiss those concerns. But at the same time, we can't turn a blind eye to the humanitarian crisis happening at our borders and the struggles of all those undocumented immigrants living in the shadows. Figuring out a solution that addresses all of those things, that balances those priorities, it's incredibly challenging.
So what might a more balanced approach actually look like? What are some of the solutions people have proposed?
Well, one idea that's been around for a while is comprehensive immigration reform. Basically, it would create a pathway to citizenship for those who are already living and working here, while also beefing up border security and cracking down on employers who hire undocumented workers.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. What would a pathway to citizenship actually involve? Like, what would the process be for someone who's undocumented right now to gain legal status?
It would probably be a multi-step thing. Individuals would come forward, pay back taxes, go through background checks, meet certain requirements like learning English, demonstrating knowledge of U.S. civics, things like that. And eventually, they could earn legal status and become citizens.
That sounds like a pretty involved process. What are some of the arguments for and against creating something like that?
Well, the folks who support it, they say it would bring millions of people out of the shadows. It would let them contribute more fully to society, without living in fear of deportation. They say it's just more practical and more humane than trying to deport millions of people who are already part of our communities.
But I imagine there are plenty of people who strongly oppose this idea, too. What are their main concerns?
The big criticism is that it basically rewards people for breaking the law. Opponents argue that it would just encourage more illegal immigration and that it undermines the rule of law. Their stance is that folks who came here illegally shouldn't be given a path to citizenship, period.
So it's a really thorny issue, clearly with strong feelings on both sides. What about the other parts of comprehensive immigration reform, like strengthening border security and cracking down on those employers who hire undocumented workers? How would that work in practice?
When it comes to border security, it could involve more manpower, more technology, better infrastructure along the border, more border patrol agents, surveillance systems, maybe even physical barriers in certain places. But there's a ton of debate about how much is actually needed and whether something like a wall along the entire border is actually effective or even necessary.
It seems like every solution comes with its own set of challenges and drawbacks.
Yeah.
What about the employers who hire undocumented workers? How do you actually enforce that?
One idea is to make E-Verify mandatory for every business. That's the system that lets employers check the legal status of their employees. So that would make it way harder for undocumented immigrants to find work and theoretically reduce the incentive to come here illegally.
But wouldn't that also create a ton of problems for small businesses? I mean, a lot of them rely on immigrant labor. And what about industries like agriculture that depend on seasonal workers? Wouldn't that hurt them too?
You're right, it's a valid point. You always have to think about the unintended consequences. And finding that right balance, it's incredibly difficult.
It's like a giant puzzle with a million pieces, each piece representing a different part of this incredibly complex issue. And then you throw in the political realities on top of that.
Exactly. Comprehensive immigration reform has been tried so many times, but it always gets bogged down in partisan politics. Democrats and Republicans have such different views on this issue, it's really hard to find any common ground.
And that's where this whole clash between Selena Gomez and Donald Trump becomes so symbolic, right? It's a perfect illustration of that larger societal divide, that inability to see eye to eye on such a polarizing issue.
You nailed it. It's easy to get sucked into the emotional arguments and the political spin, but if we ever want to make real progress on this, we have to bridge that gap somehow.
We have to be open to hearing each other out, acknowledging the valid concerns on both sides, and finding solutions that prioritize both security and compassion.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot where we can enforce our laws while also treating everyone with dignity and respect, no matter their immigration status.
It's a tough balancing act. So where does that leave us? What can regular people actually do to make a difference?
Well, step one is staying informed. Educate yourself about how complex this issue is. Read articles, reports from reliable sources, listen to podcasts like this one, talk to people with different viewpoints.
Because knowledge is power, right? The more we understand, the better we can advocate for real change. But beyond educating ourselves, what else can we do? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of this.
I hear you. It can feel daunting. But honestly, don't underestimate the power of individual action. Contact your elected officials and let them know where you stand on immigration reform. Support organizations that are working to protect immigrants' rights and push for humane policies. You can volunteer, you can donate, you can get involved in your community.
So it's about speaking up, both through our actions and our words.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix this. We all have a role to play.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of your own personal network. Talk to your friends and family about this. Share articles and stories on social media. Help raise awareness and maybe shift the conversation in a more positive direction.
It's about creating that ripple effect, starting small and then expanding outward. Even little things can make a difference when we all join forces. It's easy to get kind of lost in all the policy talk when we're discussing immigration. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to people, right? Real people whose lives are directly affected by the choices we make as a society.
Yeah, for sure.
We've talked about all the arguments for and against illegal immigration.
Yeah.
But what I'm really curious about is the human cost. What are some of the everyday challenges that undocumented immigrants face just trying to live their lives?
Okay, try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine living in a country where you're constantly afraid of being caught, detained, separated from your loved ones. That fear, it impacts every single part of your life. It's like a never-ending weight on your shoulders.
It's got to be incredibly stressful. Just the thought of doing everyday things like buying groceries or going to the doctor must feel risky.
Absolutely. And that fear makes them so vulnerable to being exploited. Undocumented immigrants, they're much more likely to be victims of wage theft, workplace abuse, all kinds of awful things. But they're often too afraid to report it, because
Yeah.
they're terrified of getting deported.
Right, they're stuck in this system that makes them invisible and leaves them with almost no protection.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to think about how many people are living like that, just trying to get by, and how easily they can be taken advantage of. And then there's the whole emotional burden of being separated from your family. We talk about the zero tolerance policy
Yeah.
and the devastating effects of those family separations.
Yeah.
But even outside of that specific policy, family separation is a constant threat for undocumented immigrants, isn't it?
It is. It's a huge issue. Those family separations, they were truly awful. And the impact on those kids and families, it's still being felt today. But even beyond that, the fear of separation, it's a constant shadow hanging over them.
So it's not just the immediate fear of deportation, but the long-term psychological impact of living with that kind of uncertainty and anxiety all the time.
Exactly. The kids growing up scared that their parents will be taken away. Parents constantly worried about being ripped apart from their kids. The trauma from that, it can be incredibly damaging. We're talking long-term mental health issues, anxiety, depression, PTSD. It can affect their entire lives.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just about abstract policy debates. This is about real people, families, lives, and those lives are deeply affected by the decisions we make as a society.
That's exactly right. We have to hear their stories. We have to factor in their experiences when we're making policies about immigration. We can't just get fixated on border security and economic numbers. We have to see the human cost.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the really tough stuff, but let's shift gears for a bit and talk about solutions. We discussed comprehensive immigration reform, which is a huge, complex undertaking. But what about more immediate actions? What can we do right now to help ease the human cost of this situation?
One thing that could make a real difference is providing more legal aid and support services to undocumented immigrants. A lot of them, they don't even know their rights, or they simply don't have the resources to navigate our legal system, which can be really confusing.
So giving them access to legal representation could help protect them from being exploited and ensure they're treated fairly.
Exactly. It could also help prevent wrongful deportations and help keep families together. And beyond legal aid, we need to invest in community organizations that provide things like social services, healthcare, and educational opportunities to these folks and their families.
Those organizations are doing such important work, helping people integrate into society, access the resources they need, build better lives for themselves and their kids. It's about empowering them, not just leaving them to struggle.
I couldn't agree more. And we also can't forget about addressing the root causes of migration. Why are people fleeing their home countries in the first place? If it's poverty, violence, lack of opportunity, we need to invest in programs that tackle those issues head on.
Right, it's about taking a long-term view, not just focusing on what's happening at the border.
Exactly. Create conditions in those countries that give people a reason to stay, a chance to build a future for themselves and their families.
So it's a multifaceted problem that needs a multifaceted approach. But something I think is super important is changing the way we view immigration. Instead of seeing it only as a problem that needs fixing, we need to recognize the potential it holds.
I like that. It's about seeing the human capital, the diverse perspectives and experiences that immigrants bring with them.
Exactly. That's something we often forget in all the heated debate.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful discussion. It feels like a good place to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, I think so too. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground today, starting with that very public clash between Selena Gomez and Donald Trump, then diving into the complex policies, most importantly, shining a light on the human stories that are at the heart of this whole immigration issue.
It's a tough issue with no easy answers, that's for sure. But hopefully this conversation has given everyone some things to think about and maybe even inspired some folks to get involved.
Absolutely. Remember, even small actions can add up and make a real difference when we all work together. Stay informed, contact your elected officials, support organizations doing good work out there. Every little bit counts.
Let's keep the conversation going. Let's challenge ourselves to see the humanity in each other, no matter what someone's immigration status is. And let's push for an immigration system that's more just and compassionate for everyone.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep learning, and keep diving deep.